Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're so glad you're here. We are here tonight to talk about our Science on Tap online event to talk about a land of wondrous cold, the race to discover Antarctica and the secrets of its ice. And I am Amanda Thomas, and I'd love to welcome you to our event this evening. As you know, as I just said, we're going to be talking about Antarctica tonight, which is interesting given that it is almost our summer solstice here in the northern hemisphere. Kind of an interesting time to be talking about the other side of the planet. But excited to hear what Gillen D'Arcy Wood has to tell us about the history of the exploration of Antarctica and the science that is going on or was going on there historically and also going on there now. And as you may see, we are talking about his book this evening. Got a copy of the book right here. And I want to say a thank you to Princeton University Press. They are the ones who got us in touch with Gillen in the first place. And they are also offering a 20% discount for this book and free shipping if you purchase through their website. And you can see their website listed on the slide there. The folks who are staffing our chat and comment channels will also put that in there, so you can go directly to the Princeton site and purchase the book. There is a code that you need, the LOWC-FG, and that is only good on the Princeton site. So I encourage you to go there and purchase the book and take a look because it's really interesting. And so thank you to Princeton Press for joining us and helping support this program. Gillen is, if you listen to our podcast, let me go and mention this here. We have a podcast called A Scientist Walks Into a Bar. And we had an interview with Gillen a couple of weeks ago where we did a short preview of talking about his book and about his work he is a associate director of education at the Institute for Sustainability, Energy, and Environment at the University of Illinois. And he's also written a book called Tambora, The Eruption That Changed the World. And so we might ask him a little bit about that at the end, but tonight, again, we're focusing on Antarctica. If you haven't already listened to our podcast, I would recommend, we have a lot of episodes on a lot of different topics. One that is particularly interesting and relevant these days, we have a topic on the neuroscience of racism with Dr. Larry Sherman, who is a neuroscientist here at Oregon Health and Sciences University here in Portland. And there's some interesting comments and science around our evolutionary responses to people of different races and how it's a hopeful message for how we can overcome some of our own innate racism. And I encourage you to take a listen and learn about that. For those of you who are new to Science on Tap, just a couple quick things. Wanted to let you know about what we do and why we do it. We have been hosting events in theaters here in the Pacific Northwest for 7 or more years. Normally, we would be in one of these lovely theaters, such as the Alberta Rose Theater that you can see in this photo. Obviously, we have moved online because we can't be in theaters these days. But our goal is to make science fun and entertaining for adults, particularly. And we typically encourage people to have some food and a beverage of their choice. And so I have my Science on Tap pint glass with my cider in there this evening. Encourage you to have whatever food or beverage you want and enjoy that this evening as well. We are having events every Thursday night at 7 p.m. Pacific. I'll be telling you at the end of tonight a little bit more about the next couple of weeks' topics, and encourage you to come back and join us for that in the coming weeks. Also, this talk tonight will be recorded and will be available on our Facebook page and on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, probably by tomorrow. Okay, so what you can expect for this evening, I'm going to tell you a few more quick things, and then I'm going to turn it over to our speaker this evening. And he's going to talk for, I don't know, 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time for some Q&A after that. So if you have questions, please, we want your questions. You can write those in the chat. If you're watching in Zoom, you can just open the little chat button on the bottom there and write those in. We have people monitoring that. There's also a Q&A section in Zoom that you can enter questions there as well. And if you're watching us on Facebook Live, you can put comments in you make a comment in the Facebook feed, and those will also be fed over to me. So once Gillen has finished his talk, I will come back on screen and ask some questions. And then he's agreed to stick around. Once we've finished the official portion of the show, he will be sticking around and answering a couple more questions if there are questions that folks didn't get answered during the official, not really official, but during the official presentation. So stick around afterward if you, then that in Zoom, unfortunately, it's not going to be available on Facebook as well. So apologies about that, but join us afterward. We will be sending out a link afterward through Zoom. If you registered through us there, we'll be posting it on our Facebook page. We'd love to get your feedback on what you like and if you have suggestions for future speakers or topics or that sort of thing. So if you filled out our questionnaire in the past, I did change it today. So there's some more questions and I'd love to get your feedback on all of those. So please, if you have a spare 5 minutes, we'd love to get your comments on the survey. Also, we want to keep these events free and available to as many people as possible, and including both our online events and our podcasts. But there are some hard costs associated with producing these events. And so if you are in a position to do so, we would be grateful for your support. You can make a one-time donation of any amount to our nonprofit partner, which is an organization called Make You Think. And you can see the link there, and we'll put those in the chat and the Facebook comments as well. You can also join us on Patreon, and if you want to get one of our shiny Science on Tap pint glasses, there are a couple levels at which you get one of those glasses as well. So check out one of those options, and please, we would be very grateful for your support so we can keep doing this, because we think it's important and we hope you do too. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I am going to welcome our speaker this evening. And again, Gillen D'Arcy Wood joins us from Illinois and is going to be talking about Land of Wondrous Cold. Please welcome Gillen D'Arcy Wood.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and welcome to everyone. And thank you for spending this evening, giving up some of your precious evening time to come on a little tour of Antarctica with me. So I'll share my screen and begin the slideshow. So, Land of Wondrous Cold, an echo of Coleridge's famous poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which of course is about a spectacular and disastrous voyage into the Southern Ocean. And a land of wonders it certainly is. Now, this is the talk that I'm giving tonight will be taken, the material for the talk is taken from my book, which Amanda's been kind enough to show to you already, Land of Wondrous Cold, The Race to Discover Antarctica and Unlock the Secrets of Its Ice. And I'll draw your attention to the subtitle there, The Race to Discover Antarctica. Now, when we think of the race to Antarctica, our minds turn automatically to the Edwardian period, just prior to the First World War, and the three-way race to the pole, which became a two-man race between Scott and Amundsen. Of course, Amundsen making the pole and making it all the way back, and Robert Scott perishing on the return voyage, tragically. Now, a lot of ink has been spilled on this Edwardian race to the pole. Very little, I think, very little attention has been given, relatively speaking, to the first race to the pole. And this is what my book treats, going back 70, 80 years to the first years of the reign of Queen Victoria and a tri-nation race to discover the South Pole, with British, French, and American expeditions converging on the high latitudes of the Southern Ocean in the years 1838 to 1842. So that's the story that I tell in my book. And I want to give you a little preview of those, a little account of those, each of those three voyages and the race itself in the body of my talk tonight. I thought I'd give, I'd begin with a little bit about the continent itself, which, as I describe in my introduction, is really the main protagonist of the book. I designed the book to be a kind of scientific journey with the three expeditions, the British, French, and American expeditions, as sort of the vehicles, the lens of the journey, but with Antarctica itself, the continent and its extraordinary history being the kind of main character. So let's begin there. And so a map, an early modern map from the late 17th century, with showing the southern hemisphere, and with terra australis incognita inscribed in bold letters over the entire bottom of the planets. So there were various theories on what must exist there prior to, in the early modern period. The one popular theory among the savants was that there must be, given the amount of given the land masses in the northern hemisphere, there must be some sort of balancing land mass in the Southern Ocean. And enough was known about the relative sparsity of land in the Southern Hemisphere to believe that, well, there must be some sort of continental anchor to the world, as it were, at the South Pole. There was a competing theory, very popular also, that the pole was open and that any voyages there would come into an open polar sea. And of course, if you think into the early modern mindset and their understanding of climate, there's no particular reason for them to believe that in traveling to the south, that one must necessarily travel into deeper and deeper cold. In fact, the popular theory was that this open polar sea would be tropical or temperate, and perhaps offer sort of bountiful lands full with native inhabitants and a cornucopia of vegetable life. But I give some description of these theories, but actually, what I was most drawn to was a theory that cropped up in the 19th century, in particular in the 1830s, from the Midwest, from where I'm talking to you tonight, from Ohio. I'll get to that on the next slide, but I just wanted to give you this slide that you might not be surprised to have seen a slide from the early, an image or map from the early modern period showing a vast gap or wasteland at the bottom of the earth. But this map is from as late as 1834, the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge in London. It's my favouritely named society, the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge. And so this is as late as 1834, a total absence of sort of cartographic knowledge at the bottom of the world. So we have the tip of South America sketched in Tasmania, but apart from that, nothing. So this is the understanding of Antarctica, or the lack thereof, when our three expeditions set out to discover what may or may not be there in the late 1830s. I like to think of it as the moonshot of the 19th century. So it's like launching expeditions into outer space with the most sort of advanced technological equipment in terms of the ships that they sent and the equipment that they had, and the best possible naval men, handpicked to lead these expeditions to in search of the seventh continent. So the theory that I'm sure will make you sit up and take notice is that not the theory of terra australis or of an open polar sea, but rather that perhaps the Earth is hollow. This was a popular theory. A war veteran from Ohio named John Sims proselytized across the entire settled United States as it was in the 1830s. And his theory became quite popular. The idea that at the poles, one travelled there, one would find an enormous hole, and that the Earth was in fact a kind of cylinder, and that there were potential, in the interstices of the Earth, there were the potential colonial lands, that the entire sort of surface of the Earth might be doubled or tripled if one took the trouble to send expeditions into the interior of the Earth. Now, if that sounds somewhat familiar, then you're not wrong. And I'll take this. Isn't this an amazing illustration? This is from a 1930s illustration of stories by Edgar Allan Poe. So I'm actually an English professor, so very much at home with the literary corpus of the 19th century. And so Edgar Allan Poe, as you can imagine, as someone with his fertile imagination, very much attracted to both hollow Earth theory and the idea of the Antarctic voyages to be launched in the late 1830s. And he wrote a couple of short stories, one called The Maelstrom, another called Message in a Bottle, which talks about mariners being sucked into the vortical whirlpool and being dragged into the center of the Earth. The idea of the Earth being hollow, if we think about in this sense the origins of science fiction and Arctic exploration can be located there in the 1830s. We get Poe's stories of a kind of journey to the center of the Earth, and that motif is then picked up very quickly by Jules Verne and introduced to a worldwide audience. So an interesting kind of literary cultural connection between this kind of tubular travel, Jules Verne style journey to the center of the Earth, and the origins of Antarctic exploration in the 1830s. Now, what really happened? Of course, we know that the Earth isn't. We know that the Earth is not hollow, and that the origins of Antarctica actually lie here, tens, indeed hundreds of millions of years ago, in the ancient supercontinent of Gondwana. Now, this image is a little misleading in that it already shows Antarctica in white, as suggesting that it's glaciated, when of course in the period of Gondwana land, which is from, let's say, 500 million years ago to 180 million years ago in the Jurassic period, Antarctica belonged to hothouse Earth and was temperate. But I think it's coloured white just to show us where it is. And the little history that I want to tell you now, and the question that I want to pose to your own active imaginations is, well, when, how, and why did Antarctica become glaciated? We take it for granted that the Arctic is cold and Antarctica likewise, but it was not always the case. And this is one of the principal stories that I tell in the book, to parallel the history of the first human encounter with Antarctica, which is a story we might tell over decadal timescales, only 180 years ago. My book also takes us back tens or hundreds of millions of years to think about the disposition of the continents, the changing disposition of the continents, and the history of Antarctic glaciation. This is Antarctica as it, of course, appears to us today. Now, the great difference between the image of Gondwana land, as I showed it to you on the previous slide, and this slide, is that Antarctica is now isolated. And the gradual breakup of Gondwana land is arguably the most sort of significant tectonic event in the history of the planet, at least as it relates to us and the planet that we now inhabit and the climate that we now enjoy. So first, South America, India, Africa separate themselves from Antarctica 180, 150 million years ago. Australia, my homeland, clings on for dear life, and then about 100 million years ago begins to separate itself. And once Antarctica is entirely freed of its Gondwana brethren and is left at its latitude, its 90-degree latitude there, the extraordinary and vital new phenomenon, Earth system phenomenon that is formed is what we know today as the Southern Ocean. So ocean rushes in around the perimeter of Antarctica. And once the gateway between Tasmania and Antarctica is opened, you have a circumpolar ocean. Now, this is so crucial to our understanding of Antarctica and its history, in that once Antarctica was isolated and surrounded by ocean, we see temperatures begin to plummet. In fact, the temperatures plummet quite suddenly, and Antarctica begins to ice over. It's a kind of chicken and egg question, because we know that the Earth system is wholly interconnected and interdependent. So does climate drive Antarctic glaciation, or Antarctic glaciation drive Earth's climate? Let me put it to you in this way, that we shouldn't think, as we're predisposed to do, that the atmospheric climate drove Antarctic glaciation. We should think rather that it is continental drift, the breakup of Gondwana, which creates the Southern Ocean, and the disposition of the continental land masses, altering the rate of thermal intake or insulation between the land masses, opening up the Southern Ocean, which then drives temperatures down across the planet. And once we have a cold ocean at the bottom of the planet, as it were, an ocean that opens out onto all the other oceans of the world, then we have a mechanism by which cold water can be distributed across the planet. This is what I mean by the idea of Antarctic glaciation, which is a product of the breakup of Gondwana land and the creation of the Southern Ocean. That Antarctic glaciation, Antarctica is a kind of engine room of ice production and cold water production, drives the evolution of Earth's climate toward the climate that we experience today. If we think about the transition between hothouse Earth and icehouse Earth, hothouse Earth is rather uniform in terms of its temperature gradient across latitudes. Our planet is a much moodier, more differentiated place with temperate, tropical, and glaciated zones. And this is a product of the existence and the formation of Antarctica. The principal argument that I make in the introduction of the book, and a reason and a pitch that I would make to you this evening, is that we should not think of Antarctica as being remote from our concerns, or remote from human history or human interests, or some sort of forbidding exotic ice kingdom at the remote end of the Earth. It is that, of course, but in terms of planetary history and human history, not to mention our future, Antarctica is a central player. Now, how do we know this, some of this deep time history of Antarctica? I want us to fast forward now to we're thinking again on decadal timescales rather than geologic timescale. Thinking back to the 1970s and the beginning of the International Oceanic Drilling Program, which is the first program to drill deep into the sediments of the ocean for the purpose initially of studying continental drift and tectonic plates, but which had the added advantage in drilling for sediment and pulling up sedimentary cores from the deep ocean, of giving us an extraordinary window into the evolution of the world's oceans and of the world's climate. Now, the ocean drilling program, it's not too much to say that it inaugurated the modern fields of paleoceanography and, to a great extent, paleoclimatology. Without this extraordinary program, where oil drilling vessels were refurbished to act as scientific research vessels, we wouldn't have the understanding of Antarctica that we have today, and the history that I was able to sketch for you, in the last 10 or 15 minutes. That's thanks to what we've learned from the drilling program. Now, how do we learn? Now, what do we learn about paleoclimate? How do we learn about paleoclimate from sedimentary deposits in the ocean? Well, these are a key reason why. These are diatoms, ubiquitous plankton in the ocean that are deposited in extraordinarily thick sort of layers in the ocean. And these are terrific climatic markers in that they have a typical species turnover of 2 to 3 million years. And if we study in their fossilized sedimented form, we study the turnover of cold-tolerant species and warm-tolerant species, we have an indication of temperature change over millions of years, going back millions of years. Now, how do we know about diatoms? Let's just toggle quickly back to my Victorians and want to introduce you here to the most eminent scientist to emerge from the 3 expeditions, a man named Joseph Dalton Hooker. Isn't he a handsome chappie? Here, he's the son of the director of the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, William Hooker. And he was young when he joined. He basically talked his way onto the British expedition without really much of a resume, but we're extremely glad he did go. He brought back a wealth of scientific sort of information and insights. Went on, and the name rings a bell. He went on to become Darwin's closest friend and lieutenant in the battle over evolution. Now, it was Joseph Dalton Hooker who, in his study of diatoms during the Antarctic expedition of 1838 to 1842, who determined, Darwin and Humboldt and others had already understood the importance of diatoms, but they believed that they were animals. It was Hooker who determined that this was vegetable life, this was plant life, and the basis of the marine food chain, and particularly in the Southern Ocean. Now, this graph here, as a prelude to describing this graph, so why are diatoms so important? Well, first of all, I mentioned that the fact that they turn over every 2 or 3 million years gives us an insight into temperature. They also give us an extraordinary insight into glaciation. That's because they secrete calcium carbonate in their shells. These become fossilized, and by analysis of the fossilized shells, we can study the oxygen, the isotopic oxygen distribution in the shell. And dependent on the consistency or the ratio between lighter and heavier oxygen isotopes, between oxygen 16 and oxygen 18, we actually have a clue as to the amount of ice that is existing in the environment at the time. The lighter isotopes, the lighter oxygen isotope preferentially evaporates, and then in the snow gun process returns as snow and ice. So conversely, an ocean that is richer in heavier oxygen isotopes, oxygen 18, is indicative of a glacial environment. So what do we have here in this slide? With my cursor show you. So just to let you absorb this, so the x-axis here is tens of millions of years ago. And here we have the evolution of the Antarctic ice sheet. Here is hothouse Earth. No Antarctic ice sheet of any description. The mid-Eocene climatic optimum through 40, 50 million years ago. And look at this extraordinary sudden dip where we have much higher concentrations of heavy oxygen isotopes in the fossilized diatom record. This signifies around here at about 34 million years ago, the transition from hothouse to icehouse Earth. Also known as the Eocene-Oligocene transition. Also known as the O1 glaciation. Also known as La Grande Coupure. Now, La Grande Coupure because the Baron Cuvier in Paris, the geologist in the Paris basin, saw in the stratigraphic record outside Paris an extraordinary faunal turnover, extinction event occurring around 34 million years ago, where you have an extinction of an extraordinary number of species, then a gap, and then the emergence of an entirely new fauna. He called it La Grande Coupure, and it's the argument that I make in our book, and I'm not the first to make the argument, of course, but that La Grande Coupure, which means the big break, was in fact our big break, in that once you move the transition from hothouse to icehouse Earth, introduces the kinds of mammalian creatures as well as cold-resistant grains that we as humans ultimately will domesticate. You see forests giving way to grasslands, a whole new roster of marsupials, a kind of planet that we would recognize beginning about 34 million years ago, also with carbon dioxide levels at close to current levels, and bottom line, a planet we might recognize. And it's a planet that we will ultimately come to dominate. So it's almost as if we can't overstate the importance of the Eocene-Oligocene transition. And why isn't it better known? Why isn't this more popularly known? That we've all heard of the end Cretaceous event and the end of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. But at least as important to the emergence of humans and to a planet that is sort of with its thermostat set to our specifications is this Eocene-Oligocene transition, which was driven, yes, by Antarctica and the glaciation of Antarctica as we see in the sedimentary record. So here's the geologic table as we know it. And so the argument that I'm making for you tonight is that just as important as the end of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago is this moment here, this transitional moment, the glaciation of Antarctica in the Eocene-Oligocene transition. Something we didn't know about at all until the 1980s and the 1990s, simply not understood. The presumption before then was that the glaciation of Antarctica was recent and perhaps coincident with the ice ages in the northern hemisphere. In fact, there's no relationship, and the glaciation of Antarctica is much earlier and much more important to planetary history than the ice ages of the Northern Hemisphere. So Hooker, in his travels, had some insight into hothouse Earth, or into, I suppose that the members, his colleagues in the Royal Society, of course, assured him that he would find no marine life whatsoever the further he travelled into the high latitudes of the Southern Hemisphere, because it's simply too cold. And of course, they were completely wrong about that. And Hooker found an extraordinary wealth of marine life and new marine species. Here's a seaweed named after him. And in the sub-Antarctic islands, and I'm thinking of his visit to Kerguelen Island in the southern Indian Ocean in particular, he discovers fossilized trees, which begins in an otherwise desolate semi-glacial island, which gives him clues that there has been over geologic time, there has been a transition from a temperate or even tropical or subtropical climate, or a warmer climate, to a glacial climate. So he's already has inklings in these voyages from the early Victorian period. Not to be sort of certified, the details not filled in, as I say, until the ocean drilling program in the 1980s. All right. So we have, that's sort of the part of the lecture devoted to our main character, which is the main character of the book, which is Antarctica itself. My real design was to tell the history of the continent, and in particular the story of Antarctica's freezing over, which is so important to us, yes, because we are now living in a period where Antarctica seems disposed to deglaciate and to shed its ice. And if I have time at the end of the talk, I'll talk a little bit about, I'll look ahead into the future to the prospects of what a deglaciated Antarctica might look like and what it might mean for us. But in the between now and then, let's. I just want to give you a little taste of the adventure stories that are at the heart of the book, the discovery journeys, and let's begin with the French, who were first off the mark in the race to Antarctica. The race kind of generated a publicity and momentum of its own. Once the French heard the Americans were thinking of going, they decided to go. And then once the French and the Americans went, the British didn't want to be left out. And so they hurriedly put together their own expedition. And it was a kind of colonial land grab that really didn't produce significant colonies for obvious reasons. But it's certainly the beginnings of the establishment of Antarctica in world consciousness. So here we are, an experienced South Seas voyager, Dumont d'Urville. He was first on the scene, and he travelled in 1838 into the Weddell Sea. What he didn't know was that the Weddell Sea is the greatest engine room of ice production on the planet. And he found himself kept at bay, thwarted by an active, dangerous, deadly ice pack, and that didn't allow him to penetrate below about 65 degrees south. He had ambitions to reach 90 degrees to make it all the way to the South Pole, or at the very least to beat Weddell's southerly mark, but he was frustrated by the ice. And here are various images that don't really capture the sort of life and death struggle he and his two corvettes and his 120 or so men had with trying to escape the ice pack, because D'Urville took the ships in, and these are sailing ships. These are, not steam powered, not icebreakers. This is old-fashioned sailing, and took them into the ice pack with no real route for escape. And what he didn't know about the Weddell Sea was what we understand better today, is that the disposition of the ice is determined by the circulation of what's called the Weddell Gyre, where great quantities of ice are formed from the freezing katabatic winds coming off the Antarctic Peninsula. So there's a constant generation of ice, which is then circulates to the north, opens up new open water from which ice can be formed. And before you know it, at least in midwinter, you have 8 million square miles of pack ice. That's in midwinter. Of course, D'Urville is there in the southern summer when the ice pack has been reduced to a kind of rump formation, but it's still twice the size of France and extremely active. What they found when they got in there was that the ice was shifting around them all the time. They'd sail into open water, find themselves trapped. It would open up again. They'd try to escape, get trapped again. It was extraordinary. It drove them to the point of insanity, trying to deal with this ice pack. So much so that D'Urville, even though he was under direct orders from the king to reach the South Pole or die in the attempt, he decided not to launch a campaign the next year. He and his men were simply too traumatized by the experience of battling the ice pack in 1838. They took 1839 off and spent it in the Pacific Islands, in Tahiti, etc., and to try to recover their morale, and then embarked on a second attempt in 1840. Well, they were not, even though they didn't exceed in penetrating particularly far south, they weren't idle, and we have our first descriptions of various Southern Ocean and Antarctic fauna, including this beautiful image of a crab-eater seal, to the French artists aboard the Astrolabe and the Zélé. Here's a beautiful image of a humpback whale. So in 1840, D'Urville tries again. This time he sets out not from Tierra del Fuego, but from the port of Hobart in Tasmania. And he has much more luck this time. So D'Urville is the first to sight and to land on the continent of East Antarctica, which makes up the majority of the Antarctic landmass. So the French are there first. And he calls the stretch of coast that he discovers, you'd think he'd name it after King Louis, or after a sponsor, or something that would earn him career advancement. But in fact, he names it after his wife, Adele D'Urville. Why does he do that? Well, particularly close to his wife, but a tragedy struck the D'Urville family while D'Urville was on this expedition. His young son, Emile, died of cholera about a month after he left Toulon. And while in Valparaiso, he received a letter from his wife full of grief and lamenting the loss of their son, Emile, and actually blaming her husband, blaming D'Urville for his absence, etc. The letter from Adele D'Urville is kept at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and I can attest that it is literally stained with tears. And so I see it as a kind of testimony, or let's say tribute to his grieving wife, that he names the coast of East Antarctica that he discovers Terre Adélie, and of course the famous penguins, the Adélie penguins, the most charismatic and ubiquitous of the Antarctic penguins. So, as you can imagine, and I've given you something of a foretaste there, I take some relish in telling the story of how the Adélie penguin got its name. I had the privilege of visiting Antarctica a few years ago, and this is the largest Adélie penguin colony in the world in Cape Adare. And another story that I tell in the book is about, and I'll only briefly touch on it here, is that you might be surprised to learn that most penguins, at least considered over evolutionary timescales, don't like the cold at all. And in fact, the history of the main history of the Southern Ocean is of a And Antarctica is of a continent and an ocean inhabited by giant warm water loving penguins that grew to as high as 1.8 or even 2 meters tall. And these dominated Eocene seas 40 million years ago, 35 million years ago. And it's with Antarctic glaciation that you begin to see a massive die-off of giant penguin species. And what we have left are, in fact, kind of anomalous remnant populations of penguin species who have adapted against the odds to the cold. Next, we have the American expedition led by this gentleman, Lieutenant Charles Wilkes, rather something of a martinet and a tyrannical captain who would later become the basis for Herman Melville's Captain Ahab. Melville and Wilkes came from families who ran in the same circles in New York City, and Melville at least knew Wilkes by reputation. But Wilkes, to his credit, was able to establish Antarctica as a continent. He took him, and this is his flagship, the beautiful USS Vincennes. And this truly was a race. He and d'Urville found themselves on the East Antarctic coast in the same days, in the same month, in January 1840, racing to plant the flag, as it were. And Wilkes's amazing achievement was to, whereas d'Urville really went in and left, planted the flag and left, Wilkes took the trouble, some would say with insane risks, to chart 1,500 miles of Antarctic coastline and thereby establish the continental dimensions of an Antarctic landmass. I'm going to return to this map in a little moment because it is particularly important to our story. I think one of the just to put in context this extraordinary achievement of Charles Wilkes is what he was dealing with, what he didn't know. I mean, the journey was obviously dangerous enough, but what he didn't know, that he was actually, the coastline that he chose to explore was the windiest and the worst in all of Antarctica, subject to hurricane-force katabatic winds 3 days out of 4. Why is this so? And this is a little opportunity to talk about Antarctic climate. Antarctica is not like other continents. It creates its own climate. We here on our, these other terrestrial land masses, where the atmosphere determines, atmospheric systems determine our climate. Antarctica creates its own. The topography of Antarctica, in particular the ice plateau, with the endless undulating plain of ice, that creates its own microclimate. So thermal inversion is a characteristic of Antarctica. That is, it's warmer at the surface than at elevation. And this leads to a constant sinking of the air, of the cold air, as it races toward the coast. And it builds up extraordinary hurricane force. And this is what we know as the katabatic winds. And in all of Antarctica, the apex of katabatic wind force is at the precise point where Charles Wilkes led his ships in January 1840, if you can reckon with that. When the Australian explorer Douglas Mawson returned in 1912, he discovered this for himself and began taking the meteorological data. And this isn't some sort of freak photo of someone falling down. This is someone attempting to walk in the wind. The only way you can actually walk along this coast, if you're on this coast, is by bending yourself at a 45-degree angle and kind of leaning into the wind is the only way of actually making any progress whatsoever. So Wilkes has taken his ships there. If you can imagine what happens when these katabatic winds meet storm systems from the Southern Ocean and relatively warmer air coming off the Southern Ocean, the storms that are created off this particular line of coast are the most cataclysmic on the planet. And it was just one such storm that the American fleet ran into, and the 4 ships, almost all of them, sank. But they all escaped miraculously, and particularly miraculously was this ship, the Peacock, not the flagship Vincennes, which Wilkes commanded, but the second largest ship. It's we have an image of it here from the Wilkes's narrative. It was driven against a large iceberg. It lost its rudder. So it lost its rudder in the middle of the ice pack, in the middle of a Southern Ocean widowmaker, and was then left with the task of sailing north through the ice pack back to Sydney. And all credit to Lieutenant William Hudson, who drew on his decades worth of naval experience to actually bring the Peacock back to Sydney. Quite an extraordinary achievement. Now I've got my eye on the time. We're getting to the third of the voyages, the British voyage. But this is an interesting look. Let's look closely at this map, which shows us a relationship, let's say, between the rival expeditions of the Americans and the British. So the darker outline is Wilkes's own map of his own cartography from the 1840 voyage. Then the actual coastline is marked in the lighter outline. So what's happened was that Wilkes mailed a version of this map to his rival, James Ross, the British captain, before the British captain set out. Whether he meant to sincerely to help Ross in his southerly voyage, or simply to gloat that basically, oh, forget it, James, the race is over, I won. Both are possible. What Ross did, though, was to use this map against Wilkes, and to basically Ross's argument was that because of the errors in the map, Wilkes's claims and his navigation, his discoveries were effectively meaningless. Now, this controversy, as you can imagine, raged for decades, and is still a matter of some international dispute over how we should rate Wilkes's discoveries, given the errors in the map. Why were these errors? Well, first of all, there is the ice pack, and he was kept at a distance from the actual coastline by the existence of the ice pack. But it's also a fact of navigating in Antarctica that because it's actually the driest place on Earth, it's a polar desert, the air is free of dust and vapor, means that you can see much further than you think you can. And that any landmarks that you might see are actually much further away than they appear. And Wilkes was certainly not the only Antarctic navigator to fall prey to this sort of physical theatre of illusions that is Antarctica. So much food for controversy, for international diplomatic turmoil because of this map. Oh, did I mention krill? Yes, Wilkes's expedition was the first to document and diagram the bottom of the Antarctic food chain, the famous krill. Now, in the last couple of minutes, I'll take you through the last of the expeditions, Sir James Clark Ross. Not for nothing was he known as the handsomest man in the Royal Navy. There he is, in a portrait that was taken after his trip to the Arctic, where he discovered the North Magnetic Pole. So this is an Arctic, a polar veteran. The British really sent their best man, and he didn't disappoint. Now, look, I find this a funny map. How can this map be funny? It's funny because look at the kink in the route that he takes from Hobart. it's because the summer before, the British and the French and the Americans, as we saw on the previous maps, had taken a different longitude and toward East Antarctica. And so Ross knew he'd been beaten to that prize. And so he threw all caution to the wind, chose a longitude no ship had ever traveled before. And by, well, let's just call it pure luck, he happened to take his ship south into what's now known as the Ross Sea, which is in fact the southernmost ocean on our planet. It took him all the way to 78 degrees south here in the Ross Sea. And it never ceases to amaze me. It should not fail to amaze us that all of these expeditions, in sailing ships, no less, and with no maps or any experience of sailing under these conditions, did not come to the ice pack and then turn away, but rather, these captains issued orders to sail into the ice pack with no proper assurance or really means of escape, just trusting dumb luck and risking their lives to sail into the pack. Really quite extraordinary. And this is the Erebus and the Terror making their way into the ice pack, where they come to the extraordinary end of their journey, which is with the twin wonders of the Ross Sea, which are the volcanoes, Mount Erebus and Mount Terror. Ross named them after his ships. There they are. And Erebus obligingly was erupting in a small way for the entertainment of Ross and his fellow sailors when they arrived there in January of 1841. And then on the very next day, if you can imagine this, they approach what is arguably the greatest geographical find of the 19th century, what Ross called the Great Icy Barrier. He called it a barrier because, being a naval man, he saw it as an obstacle, whereas we see it for the wonder that it is, and it's now known as the Ross Ice Shelf. It's an enormous plateau of ice the size of France, freestanding there in West Antarctica at the southern rim of the Ross Sea. And once Ross had spent several days sailing up and down the Ross Ice Shelf without coming to any kind of end, he decided that he had in fact reached the ends of the earth, and the weather was turning cold, and he'd better beat a hasty retreat from Antarctica. Now, as I said, I was lucky enough to visit, and here I spent perhaps, I think, the best afternoon of my life, and it was a gorgeous day on Cape Evans, looking out over Mount Erebus, where, of course, is the scenography of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. It was when the British explorers who sought to finally reach the South Pole, they followed in the path of Ross to the Ross Sea, to the foot of Erebus, and here we see Ross's hut from 1912 at the foot of Mount Erebus. And they, even though it was somewhat more difficult to reach the South Pole from here, I think that they were in such awe of James Clark Ross that they felt they owed it to him and the British tradition of Antarctic exploration to set up base camp here. And it remains today the base camp for scientific research in Antarctica. There is the Ross Ice Shelf and the eastern side of Mount Terror, from where Scott set out for the South Pole, never to return, in 1913. So I have reached the end of the lecture, and I have more slides to show that look into the future, about the prospects for Antarctica in a warming world. I think I should bring the lecture part of this this show to an end and turn it over to you for what questions you have about the material that I've discussed, or if we want to talk more about global warming and glacial melting in Antarctica, we can certainly do that. But for now, I'd like to thank you so much for tuning in and for joining me on this little tour of the Terra Australis Incognita.
Great, thank you. Fascinating stuff. I love the combination of the history and current science. And we have a question from one of the attendees who says, with info on these expeditions so sparse, how do you do research?
I could actually flip that question. Given that the documentation of these three voyages was so vast, the challenge that I actually faced was attempting to distill the information, distill and digest the information into a single book. Because to put this in perspective, we have these three voyages, each of which produced dozens of volumes of scientific observations and narrative, plus the logbooks. So quite daunting, and I think that's one reason why this book hasn't been written before, is that attempting to make sense of all three voyages and their complex intersections is quite a huge task. And I'll tell you this little story about writing the book. After 2 years working on it, I'd written about 100 or 200 pages, and my expeditions were barely across the Atlantic. And then I realized I had to speed up in my telling of the story. But first I emailed my editor at Princeton and said, would you be okay with me turning this into a 6-volume study of the discovery of Antarctica? I think I can do it in 6 volumes. And she left it for 48 hours for me to cool down, and then sent an email saying, Gillen, it's one book and one book only. And so it just got reviewed. The book just got reviewed in the Literary Review in the UK. A review by Fergus Fleming, Ian Fleming's nephew, who's actually an historian of the Arctic, and he called it a breathless account of the 3 voyages, and I take that as a compliment. So it is I take you quite quickly through the voyages because there was just such a vast amount of material. And in my bibliography, you will see more comprehensive studies of each of the voyages if you're interested. And I'd really encourage you to look into those for the full histories.
Well, first of all, let me mention that if you haven't already, if you have a question, you can ask your question in the chat or the Q&A section in Zoom. Or if you are watching on Facebook, you can add that to the comments. So we'll get those from you. But you and I talked about this a little bit, Gillen, when we did the interview for the podcast. But wondering if you would talk a little bit about why you chose these voyages as opposed to, say, Cook or Scott and Amundsen, as you mentioned earlier. Why these 3?
Yeah, I felt this was the story that hasn't been told. That that in a way, Scott and Amundsen and Shackleton in particular were not to take anything away from their achievements, but they were great self-promoters, and they achieved an enormous amount of publicity for their voyages. And it was those voyages or those discovery missions that have been mythologized. And I feel as if these Victorian era missions have been undeservedly neglected. So I did feel as if there was, thinking as a writer and a historian, I felt as if there was an opening there to tell the story of these earlier missions. Also, I'm someone, as a historian, I'm much more comfortable in the 19th century and in the early 19th century. So it's definitely in my period. But let me say one more thing, is that I feel as if the Scott and the Shackleton stories have been told over and over again. It's time for a new story. And in a way, I feel as if these explorers, Wilkes, Ross, and D'Urville are particularly well fitted to our era in that they were so vulnerable and so full of wonder and amazement and essentially fear about the land the land and the ocean that they are traveling through, that they're well fitted to our age of Antarctic anxiety. We're living in an age where we face glacial melting on a large scale and the potential inundation of many of our coastal cities because of Antarctic ice and its breakup. That in a way it was a good moment to go back to this original Antarctic encounter and try to understand it. And at the end of the book, I bring us up to the present, and the epilogue is about, well, now that we've had this deep dive into Antarctic glaciation and our encounter with it, we can really see how we can look at our own Antarctic anxiety a little differently and perhaps in a more informed way. That, Antarctica isn't just in the news now, that really it's been part of our planetary history and our human history all along. And we need to sort of relearn that so we can better understand what we're facing.
One more quick question about historical context. How many people were on each of those ships, just for scale?
Yeah, okay. So the French little corvettes, identical, the Astrolabe and Zélé, they took 65 each. And I know that 65 minimum. D'Urville lost a lot of men on his voyages. On the ice, he lost several, but he also lost dozens to dysentery. And he needed a minimum of 65 that he barely managed to muster in order to make his 1840 voyage. So there's 130 men, about the same for the British. The American expedition, and I encourage everyone to learn more about Wilkes and it was the last voyage under sail to circumnavigate the globe, a 4-year journey across the globe. So I've only taken one, the Antarctic chapter of Wilkes's extraordinary journey. He took 6 ships, lost one of them. This is a story I didn't even get to tonight. Lost one of them in the Antarctic. In the sub-Antarctic in 1839, and ended up with 5. They had in excess of 300 men. So the Americans thought big. Unfortunately, their ships were no good. So that was a real problem, that they did not have ships of the quality of the Erebus and Terror, which were, at least by Victorian standards, ice strengthened. The Americans had nothing of that kind. And so when the Americans were in Sydney about to set sail, setting off, we're getting ready to set sail to Antarctic, all the Australians, the nosy Australians, were looking over the ships, and were just saying to themselves, these are dead men. They don't stand a chance. And but Wilkes went anyway, and they managed to. Not everyone came back, but most of them did.
We only have a few minutes left, though. I know that you have agreed to stick around and answer some more questions.
Of course.
Zoom afterward, but just wanted to, if you can say in a few minutes, I've had several questions about the future of Antarctica, and you hinted at that, and I will encourage, if people want to know more about that, check out the book. There's a 20% discount to but also, would you mind just giving us a brief window into what the future of Antarctica looks like?
Yeah. So what the slides that I had remaining would show you is that there's 60 meters of sea level rise locked into the Antarctic ice cap. Now, the vast majority of that is in no danger of melting on human timescales that are in any way relevant to us. That's because East Antarctica, which makes up the majority of the landmass, is an extraordinarily high elevation. It's in fact the continent of the highest, it's the highest elevated continent on the planet. The problem is West Antarctica, which is essentially an archipelago. So if you try to imagine Antarctica, the map that I showed, imagine the ice removed from it, you would have a mountainous continent, which is East Antarctica, but then an archipelago of sort of islands and low-lying islands in the west. And that West Antarctica, there's 7 meters of sea level rise in West Antarctica alone, which is enough to completely submerge all our major coastal cities from Mumbai to Bangkok to Shanghai to Miami to Boston to New York to Alexandria to London, everything. All right. So it's West Antarctica we have our eyes on, and even in the most compressed possible timescales, and we're talking years and decades. There's a glacier that I came into some proximity with in my journey there, called the Thwaites Glacier. The Rolling Stone dubbed it the Doomsday Glacier. Now it's a glacier. It's extraordinary to even think of this, but we are actually observing the disintegration of the Thwaites Glacier in real time, effectively. It's the size of Florida and has 2 feet worth of sea level rise in it alone, which is enough to sink Miami, definitely. It's losing ice at an extraordinary rate and already has an enormous sort of hollow or hole in the middle of it. The thing about these West Antarctic glaciers is that they are grounded below sea level. So that's the key. They're not grounded on land. They're grounded below sea level so that they're being eroded both from the warmer atmosphere and by the warmer ocean currents that are circulating and undermining them. So that's this is the reason why we have all eyes on Antarctica today. We're monitoring it so closely because it's in a way there's an ironic relationship between this and the voyages that I described. My explorers were desperate to find land. That's the currency that they understood, and the ice was an obstacle for them, and in a way represented a kind of failure. Whereas for us, we're a lot less interested in terrestrial Antarctica and much more interested in it as a vast superstructure for ice and what the behavior of the ice it means for us. But it's going back to 1840 that we have the first sort of encounter and description of these glaciers and ice packs and how they behave. So an important moment, I would say again, for us to go back to these original voyages.
Sorry, that was a a fault on my part. Well, I think with that, we will say thank you to Gillen D'Arcy Wood for the moment. If you are with us on Zoom, you can stick around for some more questions. But I want to wrap up our official program for the evening. Also, just wanted to remind you again, the book is available. There is an audiobook version as well. So if that is something that you are into, I would recommend that. It's a thrilling story. But I am going to share my screen now and tell you a little bit about what is coming next. Next week on Thursday, June 18th, we will be joined by Bruce Goldfarb, who is the biographer of Frances Glessner Lee, who you may have heard of her as the person who, the woman who created the nutshell studies, which are these amazing little dioramas depicting crime scenes that were used to teach people how to do forensic science, which wasn't a thing until kind of Frances started getting involved with it. We were supposed to have Bruce here in person later this month, but that's obviously not happening. So we are having him here next week. Again, he has a book as well. Whoops, let me turn it the right direction. It's called 18 Tiny Deaths, and it's fascinating. And he'll be talking about that in some length next week. So I encourage you to come back and join us at, again, 7 p.m. next week, June 18, 7 p.m. Pacific. And then also, We will be posting tomorrow an episode of our podcast, A Scientist Walks into a Bar, a brief interview with Bruce Goldfarb in anticipation of his event next week. And if you didn't catch us at the beginning, there is also an interview with Gillen, who just spoke a couple episodes back, just talking a little bit more about this book and giving some more insight into that. So I encourage you to check out our podcast. You can find it wherever fine podcasts are sold. Again, it's called Scientist Walks into a Bar. Quick thank you to our Patreon supporters. The response on Patreon has been kind of overwhelming and extremely positive. So thank you to all of you folks who are supporting us there. I have lots of stickers and pint glasses to give away, and I don't have everybody's address. And so if you are waiting for something from me, please make sure to either send me an email or go onto Patreon and add your address in there so I can send you some of our good stuff. So thank you. And then finally, as I mentioned at the beginning, we are trying to keep these events free and available to as many people as possible, both our events and our podcasts. And we can only do that with your support. So if you are in a position to do so, we would be grateful for any amount of donation, either just a donation through our Make You Think, which is our nonprofit partner, or through Patreon, again, as I mentioned. So I'm going to leave this slide up for a little bit and welcome Gillen back up on screen, and he can answer a couple more of those questions, because I know there were some people who had questions who weren't answered. So thank you all for coming. He's going to stick around for a little bit.